So this is our rapid response round for all panelists. The question is, what would you identify as the major vulnerability in the food and agricultural system? So we'll go to each of our three. Dr. Rosenzweig is first.
Increasing extreme climate events. It can hit everywhere, anywhere throughout the entire food system. They're increasing all over the world. And we have the potential for multiple breadbasket failure because of those increases. Yeah, so that's the major vulnerability that from me, from my side.
Dr. Salvador.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, but for me, the greatest issue is socioeconomic disparity, socioeconomic inequality, with the logic being that clearly those that have a greater socioeconomic standing are better equipped to withstand the challenges of nature and actually to conduct the research that's required in order to change the way that humanity is creating climate change, and the political power to force the government to do the right things. Those who don't have a socioeconomic standing are essentially the victims of the system. So as long as we continue to believe that we live in a democracy and that every life has equal worth, then what we need to work on as a priority is reducing socioeconomic inequality. Then that will allow us to deal with the other multiple crises that humanity faces.
Ms. Daniels.
Well, I think a vulnerability was pointed out in the meat supply chain that Ricardo mentioned. So, and that's a function of the corporate consolidation and vertical integration that I mentioned. So I think it's in the too big so that it will fail category. We saw that happening. So with the consolidation of meat into 6 multinational companies that they control the meat supply of the world, and by meat I mean beef and chicken. And they had 50 processing plants in the United States. You have a problem in one plant, the whole thing gets shut down. So they obviously got support in order to continue their production, but that's a vulnerability. So this points itself toward the value of more regional food systems. And I don't mean to say regional should replace. I'm not an input substitution person. I don't think we just do regional. We have our global system, but we need to have more regional. So let's move it from 5 to 10% to 30% regional. And then if you have regional food processing, regional ownership, regional distribution, you're going to have more resilience, and it will also be more climate responsive.
Great. Okay, here's another question for the whole panel. What role might increasing attention on food safety play in your vision of where the food and ag system needs to go?
All right, well, that was open. I'll say one of the things that's interesting about food safety is that it allows for transparency and traceability. And I think that's really important. And I think building up that's an element of technology that's a really big value add for our food system. Even as we move toward an agroecological frame, if you have traceability from farm to fork, that's really important. But I would add in, a number of other elements to what you would trace along the way. I think that could be applied to our seafood as well.
So I agree with what Paula has just mentioned. I would go back to the design of the system. We have a system right now that has to be recognized as a global logistical marvel. And there are many refinements that I think collectively everybody on this call can think of. The one that I'll suggest is that a feature of this system, which has been optimized on scale and efficiency, is that if there is contamination at one point, particularly near the production side, then that can propagate fairly quickly. Before it is detected, it can be halted. And in the worst of cases, then in a country like the United States, when we see those kinds of contaminations occurring, again, in the worst of cases, you may have dozens, in some cases into low hundreds of individuals that die, become ill and die. So that should not be the red light that something needs to shift in the food system. So that means that in the design, from the very beginning, preventing those sorts of things from occurring should be a priority for a redesigned system, not to prevent the rapid propagation of infection sites. And what Paula mentioned, traceability, of course, is one of those issues. But the production methods themselves from the very beginning are also an important part of prevention.
There's a climate connection as well. The changing temperature, precipitation, humidity variables around those processing plants will be changing. This is an emerging area of research on climate change and the food system. Much, much more needs to be done because, again, while we are working on improving food safety, we have to be uh, aware of the changing risks due to the changing just environments for the microbial contamination, for example.
Very good. So here's another question for each of our panelists. One of our audience members would like to hear what your top priorities are for research.
I have one. I didn't speak about aquaculture during my program, but I think that's a top area for research and development. We've seen around the world that aquaculture is, there's now more farmed seafood being produced than beef around the world. And that intersection point, that the change in that graph started happening in 2012 and it's only increasing. In the United States, there's a lot of research being done on aquaculture, but not as much development yet. But there still needs to be a lot of work, I think, because I think it is an environmentally sustainable form of animal production as managed in the United States with our existing laws, particularly on land-based aquaculture. So I think it's an area that could use a lot of infusion of research and development dollars for collaborative research across institutions. But I also think animal feed and aqua feed is a huge area that with a lot of potential and a lot of gaps to fill there. That's a place where you could take agricultural waste and post-consumer food waste and create animal feed. It's particularly exciting in the aqua feed area. And I think many of you may have heard about already that there's a number of businesses that are funded by venture capital right now by the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars that are taking food waste to grow bugs, harvest them at the larval stage, pelletize it, and turn it into aquaculture feed, which is much more sustainable than feeding fish industrially produced soy and corn, which is currently what's happening right now. So I think those are really interesting potential areas for research and development.
Thank you.
I would say the cascading risks of COVID-19 and climate change. Have already taken this on in our portfolio of research, for example, in our group and also across AgMIP, because what we need to learn how to respond to cascading risks across the complex system. I think this is the number one thing that we should be researching now. We need to do all the other things too, all the mitigation, adaptation, on the climate change side, health side, and of course the equity side that Ricardo is bringing forward. All of those things we have to do, but right now, the global systemic risks are so great that that's my number one.
For me, it's a single word, and I'm incurring into Paula's topic here, which is agroecology. This is an area that has been bereft of the kind of research emphasis that it requires. And I mentioned it briefly earlier, but let me expand on that because there's a huge misunderstanding, if not complete lack of misunderstanding of what agroecology is. So this is essentially the view that what we're doing in agriculture is managing a combination of natural systems as well as purchased inputs. And the emphasis in the current model is on purchased inputs, for instance, replacing native fertility with purchased fertilizers, replacing beneficial insects and an equilibrium among the insect population with purchased insecticides, or with bioengineer crops to resist particular pests, and so on. Um, let me be really clear about why I think that agroecology is a better pursuit. And then I want to end by saying why we need more research on that. It is a better pursuit because it is better for all people involved. Now, at the moment, again, on the very best reading, we can say that the dominant system has saved us time. It has given us convenience. It has created an environment where most of us don't even need to be concerned about whether something is native to the place in which we live, how it's produced. We simply desire it, and if we have the purchasing power, then we can have as much of it as we want. So one can argue those benefits. It comes at tremendous cost, though, and I'm just going to talk about one cost. It is benefit, obviously, the purveyors of those inputs. And so it's really good if you're selling a certain amount of input for every acre that there is in production. It is not so good for farmers whose role ultimately in that system is to be just smart enough to figure out what technology package to buy. It's a little bit of a facile statement. It's not as simple as that, but the data show that essentially when you look at the distribution of the food dollar, a minimal amount, depending on what is being produced, actually goes to farmers. But it's a good general statement. The majority of returns to the food dollar actually in the marketing sector. And again, one could argue that this actually reflects the value of the food system. I mean, we're not having to deal with animal carcasses ourselves. We're not having to deal with milling grain ourselves and so on. That is the value that the food system is providing. What I'm saying is that we should not discount the role of farmers, and that there's a way in which greater returns to farmers, therefore to rural communities, can be increased by practicing a different style of agriculture. Let me tell you what that is. That is the style of agriculture that recognizes that there is ecological knowledge that can actually replace the expensive purchased input approach. Not denying what can be done with the purchased inputs. I mean, it's self-evident what can be accomplished. But the issue is that one can prevent a lot of the ills of row crop agriculture in such a way that the expense of those inputs is eliminated by understanding the way that ecology works.
Oh no.
Which is for weeds to express. You farm in such a way that those niches don't exist, and therefore weeds don't express. You don't need the herbicides. Same argument would go for insects. You don't create the conditions where essentially you're providing a buffet for insects. You have more biodiversity in agricultural systems so that you never have runaway instances. Now, I know these can seem romantic, and I have heard all of us have been in lots of interminable debates about how that actually may have been what agriculture's past was, and therefore this represents an argument to return to a romantic past. Here's what I promised. We have invested tremendously in the model of agriculture, which is tremendously leveraged on external inputs. Farmer in Iowa, Northeast Iowa, actually described that to me this way. He said, we used to leverage somebody else's money to make a living. Now we leverage somebody else's intelligence in order to make a living. And that's reflected in plummeting numbers of farmers. It's reflected in impoverishment and neglect of rural economies. And that reflects on the political environment of this nation, when huge swaths of the population feel like they've been left out, and they're disinvested in. These are not idle comments. These are not romantic comments. We choose to invest in an agroecological system where the return is greater to the knowledge of the farmer and the farmer's skills, then we will get different outcomes on the land, not only in terms of production, quality of production, environmental quality, but also economic and social well-being. So I can readily see that if you're an industry that's losing value proposition, why would you invest in something that would mean fewer sales to products? However, the public sector should not be constrained by that consideration. The public sector has resources to invest in land-grant universities and other public institutions to pursue this kind of research in the public interest. Now, the last thing about agroecology is that it is not replacing one technical approach by another. As I've just said, agroecology needs to be supported. It needs to be supported by policies, by markets, by the educational system. So ultimately is a different direction for the social enterprise in agriculture. And that's the ultimate insight about what agroecology represents. And I'm sorry to have rushed that, but since I find that often there's that romantic misunderstanding about what this means, I want to provide at least a brief overview. So one word, agroecology.
Thank you so much. I want to go back to one of the first questions that was posed in this morning's sessions, and each of you can respond, or a subset. Our audience member asked, how might we best leverage the knowledge of Indigenous and Black farmers and other people of color in the food and ag system to ensure food sovereignty and agroecological health?
Sounds like a question for Ricardo.
Well, the first thing to acknowledge about that, thank you, Paula. I think anybody here could take this one as well. But I think the first thing to acknowledge about that is that is a very appropriate goal to have when you take a look at folks that are disproportionately affected by not having the resources to participate in the benefits of the global capitalized system. You know, as I mentioned, going back to the table of the study on the framework for assessing the effects of the food system, equity and purchasing power are a very important component of functioning in the global cash-based economy. And since food is essentially an article of consumption in that economy, if you don't participate in that cash-based economy, then you're essentially invisible to the system. You're hungry, at least if you don't produce for yourself. So if you don't produce, you don't have the resources to buy what others produce, then you're going to be hungry. Now, that's a necessary preamble to then ask, why is it that disproportionately in the United States and throughout the American continent, it is the people of color that find themselves in that vulnerable situation? And you know, this has to summarize a lot of history, but clearly it has to do with a history of this country that is being re-examined before our eyes. Is a history of appropriating land, displacing people, genocide, enslavement of people. Building wealth is a generational phenomenon. So if in the same society you have a sector of society that has taken land, used that land for production, for mining, for forestry, has built wealth to then create institutions, has segregated who can attend the best institutions, whether they be schools for education, whether they be hospitals for public health care, and you replicate that across the generations, then that sector of society will become wealthier. What's happening with the sector of society whose land was taken, whose ancestors were enslaved, who don't have access to productive resources to generate cash income, who don't have access to the best educational institutions, who don't have access to good public health outcomes because they can't get the best health care and so on, then over generations, they become impoverished. And the two are related. It's not what happens to people, it's what we do to each other. And so what you need to do to reverse that is to realize this has taken place generationally over hundreds of years, and it can't be reversed instantaneously. There is not an elder right now who remembers that either a time when there was food sovereignty or the specific knowledge about how to produce different foodstuffs that are more consistent with the health of the people that produce those foodstuffs that can teach the present younger generation. They either died or were killed outright purposefully many generations ago. So this means rebuilding knowledge. And again, it means investing in that knowledge. First of all, acknowledging that food sovereignty means, as the concept indicates, the liberty to be able to pursue those goals, whereas at the moment, you would think that even mentioning those words were actually a declaration of war. They seem to be so antagonistic to the dominant culture. I'm hoping that I'm seeing signs that that is beginning to change, at least at the beginning level of acknowledgement that there is need for rectification of grave structural injustices across the history of this nation. So I don't offer a facile answer because there isn't, but I think it is a worthwhile goal to begin to build on. That's the realistic answer.
Let me add something here, sorry. And you know, part of what I look at is the role that different sectors can play. So you know that I come from government, and I'm looking at the role of government, and I think that government needs to examine a lot of its relationship to the food system and to foster more of the values of the relationships that need to be honored and respected throughout the food system than had been done in the past. So government was fostering an economic relationship to the food system. Government can now use its public policy tools, and there's a number of them, to make those changes. To me, your question was about science, and there are a lot of different sciences at play here, obviously. The reason I brought up aquaculture and aquafeed is because I see it, and even though that seems like intensely practical and and I am intensely practical, but I do see that as an area that is an underfunded area of research. But it's also an important linchpin in terms of environmental sustainability, because currently, for example, aquafeed is not environmentally sustainable. So if we were to direct a lot of the scientific research in that area, prove out that model, what are you also encouraging? You're also then encouraging the ability for smaller farmers to produce aquaculture, and you might have more ability for indigenous farmers or other farmers to produce aquaculture with feed that's sustainably produced. So I was going at a specific target area that I know is historically underfunded. I think USDA gets only something like 2% of the research dollars of the United States. Of that 2%, I think it's a mere fraction of that that goes into aquaculture. That's why I raise that point. But I don't want to lose the larger point that Ricardo raises. These more like acupuncture type points of research can fold into that larger frame that is a public policy frame also, and a societal frame. And I think definitely a role for research, agroecology taking into account the restorative aspect of relationships as well that Ricardo mentioned. But there's different actors along the way that should contribute in great measure and in partnership, just to tie that together.
And I'd like to also point to the intergovernmental international science bodies that, for example, create the assessments of global change. And so, for example, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, it's known as IPBES. They, in their last large, these are very large international efforts to assess knowledge. And they made, the IPBES report made a concerted effort to bring in a wider appreciation of knowledge systems, including indigenous and local knowledge. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the international body that I've have the most experience with, is beginning to do that, but it is challenging to figure out. You're supposed to be assessing the science, but really there's the contribution of the other knowledge systems is so important. So just want to highlight as we go forward in these big international science efforts, really having the indigenous and local knowledge be incorporated into those assessment processes is very important, and we need to make progress there.
Yeah, and braiding them together.
Exactly.
If I could, I want to follow up with one audience question that came up for Dr. Rosenzweig. You mentioned during your presentation that livestock play a pivotal role in world agriculture, and that pastoral systems and livestock production are quite susceptible to changes in climate that we see now and seem to be. So I'd like you to spend a little while amplifying your insights into the role of livestock, and I'd like you to address at some point what you see as a successful and humane system for food animal production that's consistent with some of these environmental and social goals.
Thank you for that question, because I think this is actually, when we're talking about big challenges, the big challenges on livestock and pastoral systems throughout the world are that's definitely up there in, I would say, top 3, top 5, because they affect so much and so many people. So let's first go to smallholder farming systems in many developing countries around the world, where there isn't this division really between crops and livestock. It's these systems are integrated and mixed. So when we are thinking, this is on the climate change side, when we are thinking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we have to be very aware and cognizant that just this is, probably a billion people, a billion smallholder farmers around the world are depending on livestock for both their food and their livelihoods. So the concept in this regard of change is we're talking in these 2 days about the transformation of the food system. So I don't think anybody's mentioned it yet, but the concept of just transitions is arising to actually deal with these challenges of how, when the people on, right, we were talking about agriculture takes place and if the food system is right there, on the ground or in the agriculture water, how we have to be cognizant of the just transitions, and developing, first of all, the awareness that this will be affecting people, that change will be affecting people's lives and livelihoods, and that as government programs are being developed, that they take this into account. And then the science of it, what can be done to create successful and sustainable agroecological systems that do include livestock and pasture. So there are many techniques that again are being tested, and some of the original ways are of raising this livestock in this integrated way can definitely be more benign into the climate change challenges of both mitigation and adaptation. On the other side of the spectrum, we have the very large commercial. We were discussing this, and when Paula said it's just 5 companies or 5 big corporations, right? So there's again, I think we have to consider transitions, right? None of this is like an overnight thing, right? So again, I think that there needs to be not also kind of cookie cutter. Definitely, we can't have a cookie cutter approach, but I think this growing awareness of the need to transition the livestock and pastoral systems to be more first thinking about the human health side as well as the planetary health. There are lots of techniques that are possible, better grazing land management. This is improved manure management, higher quality feed. We've just discussed some of the high tech things. Of course, genetic improvement. There's lots, and then there's the very high tech kind of thing as well, all the way to food, meat from other things, not actually animals, or cellular things like that. So there's lots of, I think, opportunity. I think it's very, very critical, very important, massive challenge across the whole spectrum. Let's be sure that we really work together to create just transitions for these transformations.
I want to agree with that. And I think that's such an important point. And I mentioned just very quickly as I was concluding my comments about the energy system as a parallel, but it's worth examining because it was a fairly monolithic system dependent on fossil fuels throughout the 20th century. What started assisting with the transition to renewable energy was the role of local governments that set targets for renewable energy production over a period of time. And they examined their portfolio and looked at how they could start transitioning toward those targets. So I would argue that you can do the same for the food system, that in each region, you could set targets for how you want to transition toward over a period of time, toward a more regionally resilient food system that has these attributes, and create markets for the newer production so that there can be a transition from an existing model to the more regenerative model. But it does depend on market dynamics.
Okay, we have 10 minutes left in this morning's session, and we're going to have to adhere to that strictly. And I want to pose one question that came up repeatedly when the planning committee was discussing some of the key vulnerabilities of the food and ag system, and that relates to the quantity and quality of water we have available directly as it affects agriculture and food. So in the time remaining to us, I'd like for each of you to succinctly address what you see as the critical vulnerabilities and where are the places that we can do the most to improve our status with regard to water quantity and quality in the medium term and the longer term.
Who do you want to go first? I'll jump in. I was a public works commissioner. That's one of my disclosures. And in that capacity, I oversaw, and at the same time, I was on the board of the California Bay Delta Authority, which oversaw the state water project that irrigates the Central Valley of California and all of our specialty crops. The opportunity for reuse, water reuse, is fairly significant. It's more of a challenge in rural agricultural areas, but there are definitely those places where it's coming online. The reason I bring up the Public Works Commissioner position is that we oversaw the Bureau of Sanitation. So we produce recycled water. Obviously, there's a lot of plumbing involved in making these changes, but there are definitely countries, Israel among them, that have a greater use of retreated, treated recycled water in agriculture. My understanding is there's something like 60 to 70% at that level. And we're definitely not that in the United States, but we have some plants coming online in Ventura County, which is an agricultural county, that is using treated city water for agricultural purposes. So that's an option. I'm going right to the technical answer. There's a larger frame for that, but I'm sure my colleagues will be able to address that as well.
Dr. Rosenzweig.
I want to go back to the work that I showed by Jonas Jägermeier, and who was addressing this worldwide. But again, anything that's, this worldwide scale is, of course, has to be transferred to the regions and with the locally context specific, what will work, and the stakeholders and the farmer, the farmers, the local governments, all of that. But, there are definite techniques. But first of all, on the water, I think there needs to be far more recognition across all the systems of every place where people grow food, that the ecosystems require water too. This dual need of our water sources. Up until now, I think there has been, there's really been very similar to some of the, things with this sort of historical trajectory that we've been talking about. I mean, in the beginning, it's like, oh, a river, oh, underground water, oh, a lake. We're just going to use it to grow food, right? We're going to dam everything and have big agricultural development projects across the whole world. As you know, that was a big part of development for a long time. So now there really is this growing, but I think we need to do more. I think we need a massive social media campaign and a media campaign to really all of us understand that the water has to be shared with the agro ecosystems everywhere in all the regions of the world. That's the number one thing. The second is then again, in the work of Jonas Jägermeier, they just chose two: soil water on the rain-fed, soil water conservation, and water harvesting. On the irrigation side, we have the techniques, just making them more efficient. Of course, we have drip. It doesn't work in every setting, but we know all that. 6 ways to Sunday, but also surface sprinkler, rather than surface. Just really reserving surface irrigation for rice paddy And then even now there's, you know, a rice paddy with intermittent irrigation. So we have techniques. I think what we have to do is have this big campaign of understanding to make it happen.
Yeah, I think both of you have said what needs to be said. I'm just going to re-articulate. I think there needs to be greater awareness, not only among researchers, practitioners, but also public officials about where we sit in the hydrological system of any point on the earth and what production systems and in general life systems are viable on that place, with the agricultural production system being a component subordinate to the life system in any particular place. So, you know, there has been a history, as Dr. Rosenzweig just talked about, worshiping a technological approach to create so-called you know, blooms in the desert, which are ultimately unsustainable because they can only be viable by definition for a given period of time, measured almost directly by the store of water that's being extracted. And so much better to actually think about the complement of strategies that have already been listed. Lots of things that need to be interleaved, but ultimately finding the production systems that are the most consistent with the hydric environment in which we're in. One very topical environment right now is that it's becoming very clear what some of the climatic patterns are across the Midwest, just to be really parochial here within the United States, but we have the climate scientists here to calibrate for the entire planet, that the grain-based system that is developed there for over a century and a half and has become highly specialized across infrastructure, knowledge systems, and so on, is not going to be viable there probably within the next half century, and that it's being pushed by climatic patterns so that it's going to migrate further north. If something like this had occurred earlier, before our full understanding of atmospheric systems and our ability to predict this, then it might have been disastrous because we would experience it as catastrophic food system failure. As well as adapting to it. And public policy has a huge role in terms of actually helping us plan in advance for that transition so that no one is left behind. And the other thing is that the educational system, again, as has been mentioned already, has a huge role in making us aware that we are contingent creatures subject to these massive atmospheric dynamics, and that it is in our interest, if we are going to survive, to learn to work within those dynamics rather than to continue in the futile, deluded belief that we can overcome them perpetually. In fact, we've only been playing a shell game with natural resources. So I think an illumined application of science to the challenges that we can already foresee, in the same way that weather forecasts today tell us that hurricanes are coming accurately and saved thousands of deaths that just 100 years ago would have caught us all by surprise. That scientific knowledge can be used to act upon, not just to forecast, but to begin to plan right now for the reality that's ahead of us in just a few decades' time.
Okay. I hate to cut it off here. We had many more questions from the audience, but we're going to take a break here for an hour and reconvene at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. I want to express my sincere thanks to each of our panelists this morning and to Dr. Stover for getting us going. Our session this afternoon that will convene at 1:30 is going to focus on resilience of the food system. We've heard some of the shortcomings and vulnerabilities this morning, and this afternoon we're going to shift our focus more to look at where sources of resilience might be found. So mentally, let's thank all of our presenters this morning. We have a network distributed around the world, so let's think of them and thank them. And we'll see you all back here at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Many thanks.